I didn't know my life was about to fracture into a clean before and after while I was standing at the kitchen sink, my hands submerged in soapy water. The house was quiet in that dull, familiar way it always was when my husband traveled. Mark had been in Costa Rica for almost a week on what he called a spiritual wellness retreat with his friends. Yoga, meditation, reconnecting with himself. Those were his words. I had repeated them to myself like a mantra every night, convincing myself that supportive wives didn't ask too many questions. My phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen casually, then froze, my fingers tightening around a plate I nearly dropped. You won't believe this. I just ran into Emily here at the resort. What are the chances? Be a good girl and don't stress about anything. For a second, I thought I'd misread it. I wiped my wet hands on the dish towel and read it again, slower, word by word. Emily, his college ex, the woman he dated for 2 years before he met me, the one he'd always described as ancient history. And then that phrase, be a good girl. My stomach twisted, not just from the implication, but from the tone, condescending, patronizing, as if I were a child who needed reassurance, not a wife who deserved respect. I stared at the message, waiting for a follow-up, a photo, a joke, some explanation that would make this feel less calculated. Nothing came. Costa Rica isn't a grocery store where you bump into people by accident. It's a country, thousands of miles away, and Emily wasn't some world traveler. The last time Mark had mentioned her, she barely left her home state. 2 days earlier, he'd called me giddy with excitement, telling me how spontaneous this trip had been, how freeing it felt to escape routine. He'd said that word, spontaneous, at least 3 times. Standing there in the quiet kitchen, I felt something shift inside me. A memory surfaced uninvited. A month ago, his laptop, a messaging app, a contact saved as just E, the way he'd closed the screen too quickly, the way he'd smiled and said, work stuff, nothing important. I set the plate down carefully. I wasn't panicking, I wasn't crying. I was calm in a way that scared me. He wanted me to relax and not stress. Fine. I was about to relax so completely that it would change everything about our marriage, and he had no idea what he'd just started. Before that text message, before Costa Rica became a word that tasted bitter in my mouth, I would have told anyone that my marriage was solid, not perfect, but real, stable, built on trust. My name is Laura. I'm 34 years old, and for the last 7 years, I'd been Mark's wife. We met in our mid-20s at a coworker's birthday party, one of those crowded bars where conversations blur together and you shout your name over music that's too loud. Mark had stood beside me while we waited for drinks, making dry, sarcastic comments about the DJ. I laughed harder than I should have. It felt easy, natural. He was charming without trying too hard, thoughtful in small ways, remembering my coffee order, texting to make sure I got home safe. When he talked about his past, he framed it neatly. A few relationships that didn't work out, lessons learned. Emily was mentioned once or twice, always casually, like an old chapter that had already been closed and shelved. I believed him. We dated for 3 years before he proposed. He gave me the ring at a quiet overlook outside the city, his hands shaking slightly as he asked. I remember thinking that the vulnerability in his eyes meant safety, commitment, something chosen, not temporary. Marriage settled into routine. I worked in project management. Long hours, steady income, predictable stress. Mark worked in marketing, often traveling for conferences or client meetings. We weren't dramatic people. No screaming matches, no doors slammed. When problems came up, they arrived softly. Missed dinners, distracted conversations, Mark checking his phone a little too often. I told myself that was adulthood. Looking back, there were signs. Small, easy to ignore ones. He became protective of his phone, always angling the screen away. He started talking more about needing space, not from me, specifically, just from life, from expectations, from routine. His friends echoed it too, praising him for prioritizing himself. I didn't want to be the wife who suffocated her husband, so I gave him room. When he told me about the Costa Rica trip, he framed it as last minute, a chance to reconnect with himself. He said one of his friends had organized it quickly, that it was now or never. I asked practical questions. Dates, location, who was going. He answered smoothly, confidently. I even helped him pack. His family encouraged it. His sister told me I was being wonderfully supportive. "You're such a good wife," she said, smiling. Not everyone would be this understanding. I wore that praise like armor. The night before he left, we stood in the kitchen together, and he hugged me tightly. Too tightly, now that I think about it. He kissed my forehead and said, "Trust me." I did. That's what made the text message hurt the way it did. Not just because of Emily, but because it reframed everything that came before it. The encouragement, the praise, the way I'd been quietly coached into silence. Standing in the kitchen, after reading that message, I realized something uncomfortable. I hadn't just trusted my husband. I had been trained to doubt myself. And once that realization settled in, there was no way to unsee it. After that first text, the day didn't explode into chaos the way betrayal stories usually do. There was no dramatic confrontation, no suitcase thrown onto the lawn, no screaming phone call that woke the neighbors. Instead, everything became sharper, like my senses had been turned up without my permission. I finished the dishes, wiped down the counters, folded a load of laundry, normal motions that should have soothed me. But my mind kept circling the same question, again and again, like a tongue pressing a sore tooth. What are the chances? That was the part that didn't fit. Not even the mention of Emily. People ran into people sometimes. But Costa Rica wasn't my neighborhood. Mark wasn't impulsive with money or travel, and spiritual retreat wasn't his style unless it came with good food and someone else doing the planning. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, listening to it click faintly with each rotation. I tried to force myself into reason. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it really is coincidence. But then the phrasing returned. Be a good girl. Mark didn't talk like that when he respected me. He talked like that when he wanted obedience, when he wanted the conversation to end. The next morning, I couldn't stop myself. I went to our shared home office, opened his laptop, and stared at the screen like it might judge me. Mark was careless with passwords. He always had been. It used to annoy me because I worried about hacking. Now it felt like the universe had placed a loose thread in my hand and dared me to pull. I told myself I was only checking one thing, just enough to calm down. But the moment I saw the messaging app load, his account still logged in, I felt my stomach drop. Not from what I'd found yet, but from how familiar the situation felt. Because a month ago, I'd borrowed his laptop when mine was updating. I remembered clicking the wrong icon and seeing a conversation thread open with someone saved as just E. I remembered Mark appearing behind me too quickly, as if he'd been listening for the exact sound of that app. He'd laughed lightly, closed the screen, and said it was work stuff. Now, with him thousands of miles away, the same letter stared back at me again. E. My hands started to shake, not wildly, not dramatically, just a subtle tremor, like my body was trying to warn me, even as my brain begged for denial. I clicked. The messages didn't begin recently. That was the first punch. They went back weeks, months, casual at first, catching up, jokes and nostalgic references. Then the tone shifted. Plans, specifics, the kind of careful coordination you don't do when you run into someone by accident. And woven through it all was one repeating theme, Mark narrating me like a character in a story he controlled. She won't suspect anything. She trusts me. She's anxious sometimes, easy to calm down. I sat there in the office chair, the leather cold against the backs of my legs, and suddenly every small moment in the last few months rearranged itself into a pattern. His late nights, networking. His sudden interest in looking better, new gym schedule, new clothes. The way his friends smiled at me a little too warmly when he announced the trip, as if they were congratulating me for playing my part. And that's what it felt like I'd been cast. The air in the room felt thick, heavy. My throat tightened. I swallowed hard, but it didn't help. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was evidence. And yet, strangely, underneath the nausea and the sting behind my eyes, there was a new emotion blooming. Quiet, clear, and terrifying in its calmness. Control. Not his. Mine. I didn't confront Mark right away. That was the first real decision I made that wasn't driven by fear. I sat in the office chair, the laptop still glowing in front of me, and forced myself to breathe slowly. 4 counts in, 4 counts out, until the trembling in my hands eased. I knew instinctively that if I reacted too fast, I'd lose something important. Clarity, leverage, the truth, fully formed. Then my phone buzzed. Another message from him. Hope you're not worrying about me. You know how anxious you can get. I'm just catching up with an old friend. Nothing for you to stress about. I stared at the screen, my vision narrowing. There it was again, the rewrite, the subtle suggestion that any discomfort I felt was my flaw, not his behavior. My chest felt tight, like a band had been cinched around my ribs. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. But instead of spiraling, something inside me went very still. I walked to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and grabbed a cold bottle of water. The plastic crinkled loudly in the quiet room. I took a long drink, grounding myself in the physical sensation, the cold, the swallow, the way my hands steadied. Then I went back to the laptop. This time I didn't skim. I read everything. Message after message laid out a timeline that made my skin crawl. Mark hadn't run into Emily. He'd planned to meet her. He'd researched resorts, compared flight dates, coordinated schedules. The spiritual retreat had been a cover story polished over months, not days. One line made my breath hitch. I finally found the perfect excuse with this trip. She won't question it. She never does. I pressed my lips together, tasting something bitter. Another message followed. I need to see you without her hovering over everything. Costa Rica feels right. Neutral ground. Neutral. As if our marriage were an inconvenience to maneuver around, not a commitment he'd made. My phone buzzed again. A photo this time. A beach sunset. Palm trees silhouetted against orange light. Wish you were here. You'd love it. So peaceful. I almost laughed. My body felt strange, like I was observing myself from a distance. My palms were cool, my breathing even. The shock had passed, leaving behind something sharper and more focused. That was the moment it fully clicked. He wasn't just cheating. He was managing me. Managing my reactions, my self-doubt, my desire to be reasonable. He was counting on my patience to buy himself time. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes briefly. When I opened them, I made a choice. If he wanted me relaxed, I would be relaxed. But not in the way he expected. I spent the rest of the morning documenting everything. Screenshots, dates, times. I emailed copies to myself and saved them to a cloud folder he didn't have access to. I checked browser history, searches about reconnecting with an ex, relationship closure, how to avoid suspicion while married. Each click felt surreal, like uncovering evidence in someone else's life. Around noon, my phone rang. Mark. I watched it vibrate across the counter and let it stop on its own. A minute later, another call. Then a text. Why aren't you answering? Everything okay? I smiled faintly. For once, he was the one uncertain. When I finally responded, my thumbs moved calmly over the screen. Everything's fine. I'm relaxing like you suggested. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Good, that's all I wanted. I set the phone face down. The inciting incident wasn't the affair itself. It was the realization that the marriage I thought I was in had been quietly replaced with something else, something where my role was to stay agreeable while he explored his options. And I wasn't going to play that role anymore. That afternoon, the house felt different. Not emptier, clearer. I moved through the room slowly, aware of every sound. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. My own footsteps echoing faintly on the hardwood floors. It felt like I was inhabiting my life again, instead of orbiting someone else's. I sat on the edge of the couch and let myself feel it properly. The hurt came first, not in dramatic waves, but in a deep, quiet ache. 7 years of memories pressed against my chest. Holidays, shared jokes, the way Mark used to reach for my hand in crowded rooms. I thought about the woman I'd been at the beginning of our marriage. Open, trusting, convinced that love meant flexibility. Where did I bend too much, I wondered. I replayed conversations from the last year, noticing how often I'd apologized when I was the one asking reasonable questions, how easily I'd accepted being told I was overthinking, how often my discomfort had been reframed as inconvenience. There was guilt, too. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I'd ignored my intuition. I'd felt the unease and smoothed it over instead of listening. Around 4 p.m., my phone buzzed again. Having an amazing time. You'd really benefit from relaxing more often. When I get back, we should plan something spontaneous together. I read it twice, then set the phone down. Spontaneous. The word felt hollow now. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my laptop and searched for divorce attorneys in our city. I didn't commit to anything. I just read. Reviews. Articles. What to expect. It felt oddly grounding, like researching insurance before a storm fully hit. I wasn't declaring war. I was preparing. A knock at the door startled me out of my thoughts. It was Ethan, our neighbor from 2 houses down. He was holding a package that had been misdelivered. "Hey, Laura," he said with a polite smile. "This showed up on our porch." "Thanks," I replied, taking it. Our fingers brushed briefly, normal, unremarkable human contact, and yet it reminded me of something important. The world hadn't ended. After he left, I made myself dinner. Actually cooked instead of picking at leftovers. I ate at the table, not on the couch, and noticed how steady my appetite was. That surprised me. Later that evening, my phone rang again. Mark. I answered this time. "Hey," I said evenly. "Why didn't you respond earlier?" His voice was light, but there was tension underneath. "I was busy." "With what?" "Living my life." There was a pause. "You sound different." "I feel different." He laughed softly. "That's good. This trip is really doing wonders for perspective." "I'm sure it is." Silence stretched between us, heavy and unfamiliar. "Everything okay?" he asked finally. I looked out the window at the darkening sky. Yes. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the truth he expected. That night, I didn't cry myself to sleep. I didn't rehearse confrontations or craft emotional speeches in my head. Instead, I slept deeply, heavily, for the first time in weeks. In the morning, I woke up with a sense of resolve that surprised me. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about him anymore. It was about me realizing that I had been quietly shrinking to accommodate someone else's comfort and deciding I was done doing that. My reaction wasn't explosive. It was deliberate. And that made it far more dangerous than any argument ever could. The shift didn't announce itself loudly. It crept in through Mark's messages. The first night after our phone call, his texts became more frequent, shorter, sharper, less poetic about sunsets and more focused on me. "What are you doing right now? Did you eat? Why aren't you answering as fast as usual?" I answered selectively, calmly, never defensively. "I'm fine, just relaxing, busy with my own things." Each reply felt like placing a weight on the other side of a scale he was desperately trying to tip back in his favor. The next morning, his sister called. I stared at her name on my screen for a full 5 seconds before answering. "Hey," I said. "Laura, hi." Her tone was overly warm, concern wrapped in sugar. "I just wanted to check in. Mark mentioned you sounded a bit distant." "Of course he did." "I'm okay," I replied. "Why?" "Well," she hesitated theatrically. "You know Mark. He worries when things feel off. This trip is really important for him." "I understand." "You've always been so supportive," she continued. "It would be a shame if unnecessary stress ruined something he needs so badly." There it was. The unspoken instruction. Don't make this uncomfortable. "I'm not stressing," I said evenly. "He asked me not to." Another pause. "Right, of course." She changed the subject, talked about work, about family gossip. When we hung up, I felt the familiar urge to replay the conversation and question myself. I didn't. That afternoon, I received a message from Mark that made my jaw tighten. "Emily says hi. She remembers you from the graduation party years ago. Says you seem nice." My fingers hovered over the screen. This wasn't casual. This was provocation. I imagined them together, him showing her my reaction, narrating my silence, framing it however suited him. I imagined her laughing, secure in the knowledge that she was a topic of discussion in my marriage. I typed back slowly. "That's kind of her. I hope you're both enjoying the retreat." Within seconds, my phone rang. "What was that supposed to mean?" he demanded. "What part?" "You know exactly what part. You're being weird." I leaned back against the kitchen counter. "I'm being polite." "You're being cold." "Am I?" "Yes, you're not acting like yourself." "I think I am." He exhaled sharply. "Emily and I are just talking. You don't need to get passive-aggressive about it." "I'm not passive-aggressive. I'm passive. You asked me to be." "That's not fair." "What's not fair?" "You turning this around on me." "I'm not turning anything around. I'm following your lead." Silence. Then, softer. "You're making me uncomfortable." That almost made me laugh. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said. "That's how I felt reading your text." He didn't respond immediately. When he did, his tone had shifted, controlled, careful. "Let's talk when I get home." "When is that?" "Soon." Soon. Vague, convenient. Over the next 2 days, the pressure intensified. His mother texted, asking if everything was all right. A mutual friend casually mentioned that Mark seemed confused and worried about me. The narrative was forming, and I could see it clearly now. I was being positioned as the problem. The anxious wife, the unpredictable variable. But something unexpected happened alongside the escalation. I felt myself changing. I stopped checking my phone compulsively. I went to work focused, present. I started running again in the mornings, letting my breath and footsteps drown out my thoughts. I slept without that familiar knot in my stomach. The more he tried to pull me back into orbit, the more distance I felt. One evening, my phone buzzed with a long message. I feel like you're punishing me for being honest. This trip was about clarity, about figuring out what I want so I can be a better husband to you. I read it slowly. Then I closed my eyes and listened to my own breath. Finally, I replied, I'm not punishing you, I'm respecting myself. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. You're scaring me. That was the moment I knew. Not because I was doing anything wrong, but because I was no longer predictable. And unpredictability is terrifying to someone who relies on control. The escalation wasn't loud. It was psychological. And it was pushing us both toward a breaking point neither of us could avoid anymore. The breaking point didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived in the middle of the night. I woke up at 2:17 a.m., heart racing, the room completely dark. For a few seconds, I didn't know why I was awake, just that something felt wrong. Then I reached for my phone on the nightstand. 17 missed calls, all from Mark. My chest tightened, not with panic, but with a heavy, sinking exhaustion. I unlocked the phone and scrolled through the messages in order, watching the emotional arc unfold in real time. At first, they were calm. Why aren't you answering? I just want to talk. Then irritated. This isn't fair, Laura. You're deliberately shutting me out. Then accusatory. I can't believe you're acting like this, after everything I've done for us. And finally, desperate. Please, I'm coming home early. We need to fix this before it's too late. I set the phone down on my chest and stared at the ceiling, my breath shallow. The fan above me spun lazily, the same way it had the night I first read his message from Costa Rica. It felt like weeks ago. It had only been days. For the first time since all this began, the calm cracked. A wave of grief washed over me so suddenly I had to sit up. My throat burned. My eyes stung. Not because I wanted him back, but because I finally allowed myself to mourn the marriage I thought I had. 7 years doesn't disappear quietly. I cried then, silently. One hand pressed over my mouth, the other clutching the sheets. I cried for the woman who trusted without hesitation, for the plans we made casually, assuming they were solid, for the version of myself who believed love meant endurance. I whispered into the dark, how did it come to this? And underneath that grief was something sharper, humiliation. The realization that he had been willing to test drive another life while keeping me on hold, that I'd been treated as a backup plan without my consent, that his panic hadn't started when he betrayed me, but when he lost control over my reactions. That was the darkest truth. I wasn't devastated because he might leave. I was devastated because I finally saw how little my feelings had factored into his choices. Around 3 a.m., another message came through. I made a mistake. I don't know what I was thinking. Please don't throw away our marriage. I closed my eyes. This was the moment where I could still go back to the old version of myself, the one who soothed, reassured, compromised, the one who absorbed discomfort so others didn't have to. It would be so easy to respond. We'll talk when you get home. I just need time. I love you. 3 sentences, a bridge back to familiar pain. Instead, I did nothing. And in that silence, I felt the full weight of my loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone in a bed, but the deeper kind, the loneliness of being unseen in your own marriage. When the sky began to lighten just before dawn, I got out of bed and stood by the window. The street was empty, peaceful. The world hadn't ended. People would wake up, go to work, drink coffee, live their lives. I realized something then with painful clarity. If I stayed, this cycle would repeat. Different destination, different excuse, same manipulation. This wasn't a bad moment. This was a pattern. And I was standing at the center of it, deciding whether to disappear back into it or step out entirely. By the time the sun fully rose, my tears had dried. My face felt tight, my eyes swollen, but my mind was clear. This was my lowest point, not because I was powerless, but because I was finally honest. And honesty, when it arrives after years of self-betrayal, hurts like hell. The morning Mark texted, "Flight lands tonight. We need to talk." I didn't feel dread. I felt resolved. I replied simply, "Okay." Then I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the wood like it always had. The normalcy of it grounded me. This house had witnessed our entire marriage, late-night conversations, laughter, tension, silence. Today, it would witness truth. I spent the morning organizing, not emotionally, but practically. I printed screenshots, highlighted dates, arranged messages in chronological order, not as ammunition, but as clarity, for myself. Around noon, I called a divorce attorney whose name I'd saved days earlier. His voice was calm, professional. He didn't dramatize anything. He listened. When I finished explaining, he paused and said, "Based on what you've described, you're not reacting impulsively. You're responding to a sustained breach of trust." That sentence settled something deep in my chest. I wasn't overreacting. I was responding appropriately. We scheduled a consultation for the next morning. When I hung up, I didn't feel empowered in a cinematic way. I felt steady, grounded, like my feet were finally planted on solid ground instead of shifting sand. At 5:42 p.m., I heard the front door open. Mark stepped inside, suitcase rolling behind him, skin bronzed, eyes tired. He looked at me like he was gauging a storm's direction. "Hey," he said cautiously. "Hey." He set the suitcase down slowly, as if sudden movements might shatter something fragile. "We need to talk," he said. "I know." He gestured toward the living room. "Can we sit?" "I'd prefer the kitchen." He followed me in, his eyes landing on the neatly stacked papers on the table. His posture stiffened. "What's that?" he asked. "Context," I replied, "since you said I misunderstood." He swallowed and sat. "I want to explain," he began quickly. "What happened in Costa Rica wasn't what it looked like." "I'm listening." He took a breath. "Emily and we have history, unresolved things. When she mentioned she'd be traveling, I thought maybe seeing her would help me get closure, so I could fully commit to us." I slid one of the printed messages across the table. "I finally found the perfect excuse with this trip. She won't question it." His face drained of color. That was taken out of context. I slid another one forward. "Your wife trusts you completely." He didn't reach for it. "You planned this for months," I said quietly. "You lied to my face, and when I sensed something was wrong, you told me to relax." "I was confused," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't know what I felt." "And instead of talking to me," I replied, "you managed me." He looked up sharply. "I never meant to hurt you." "I know," I said. "You meant to protect your options." Silence pressed in around us. "I came home early because I realized I was about to lose you," he said finally. "That scared me." "That's the problem," I said. "You didn't come home because you hurt me. You came home because you felt threatened." Tears filled his eyes. "I love you." I believed him. And that's what made this next part so clear. Love without respect isn't enough for me anymore. I stood and slid the final document toward him. "What is this?" he asked, though he already knew. "My decision." His eyes widened. "You're serious?" "Yes." "You're really going to end our marriage over this?" "No," I said calmly. "I'm ending it because this showed me who I would become if I stayed." He reached for my hand. I stepped back. "I deserve a relationship where I'm not managed," I said, "where I don't have to be a good girl to keep peace." He broke then. Tears, apologies, promises. But the turning point had already passed. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to convince him of my worth. I already knew it. The days after Mark moved out were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, not yet, but stripped of noise. No constant checking of my phone, no monitoring tone shifts in his voice, no rehearsing conversations in my head before they happened. Just silence, heavy at first, then slowly breathable. Mark didn't accept the reality immediately. The first phase was denial. He texted long messages filled with logic, how every marriage goes through confusion, how nothing physical had happened yet, how we were throwing away something salvageable. He sent articles about forgiveness, about rebuilding trust, about how couples came back stronger after betrayal. I read them all. I didn't respond. Then came bargaining. He showed up at the house one afternoon without warning, standing on the porch like a man waiting for a verdict. I didn't let him in. "I'll cut off all contact with Emily," he said quickly, eyes searching my face. "I already blocked her. We can do counseling. I'll do individual therapy. I'll do anything." "I know," I said softly. "Then why won't you reconsider?" Because none of that changed the past. Because none of it addressed the months of manipulation. Because the promises only appeared once his safety net was threatened. I didn't say those things out loud. I didn't need to. "I'm not angry," I told him. "I'm finished." That was the moment his expression shifted, from pleading to resentful. "So that's it?" he snapped. 7 years and you won't even try?" "I tried," I said, "for a long time, quietly." He left without another word. The narrative outside our marriage began to collapse soon after. His sister stopped calling when I didn't soften the story to protect him. A mutual friend admitted, awkwardly, that Mark had told them he was considering his options before the trip, words that no longer sounded accidental. Emily didn't stay silent either. She messaged me once, just once. "I didn't mean to hurt you. He told me you were basically checked out of the marriage." I stared at the words, feeling something cold and steady settle in my chest. I didn't reply. I didn't need closure from her. I already had it. The consequences reached Mark faster than he expected. His image, carefully curated as the thoughtful husband needing space, fractured under consistency. Stories didn't line up. Timelines contradicted each other. People noticed. And I did nothing to accelerate it. I simply told the truth when asked. Not with bitterness, not with dramatics. Just facts. The divorce process moved forward efficiently. Documentation spoke louder than emotion. His attempt to frame the situation as mutual, drifting apart, dissolved under evidence of planning and deception. By the time papers were signed, Mark looked smaller somehow, less certain, less sure of the story he'd once controlled so easily. On the final day, as we stood across from each other in the attorney's office, he said quietly, "I never thought you'd actually walk away." "I didn't either," I replied, until I realized staying meant walking away from myself. He didn't respond. And when I walked out of that building, the weight I'd been carrying for years finally lifted, not all at once, but enough that I could breathe. The fallout wasn't explosive. It was inevitable. And for the first time, the consequences landed where they belonged. 6 months later, my life looked quieter on the outside. No dramatic upgrades, no sudden reinvention, just a smaller apartment with sunlight in the mornings, plants on the windowsill, and a sense of order that reflected who I actually was, the kind of space where nothing needed explaining. I slept better. I laughed more, real laughter, not the careful kind meant to smooth tension. My work felt lighter without the emotional drain of managing someone else's moods. Even my body felt different, like it wasn't bracing for impact anymore. Mark faded from my daily thoughts, not because I hated him, but because he no longer defined the emotional climate of my life. Once I ran into him at the grocery store. He looked surprised to see me calm, centered, unrushed. We exchanged polite hellos, nothing more. When I walked away, I didn't feel triumph. I felt relief. The lesson I carried forward wasn't about infidelity alone. It was about boundaries, about the subtle danger of being praised for being understanding when what's really being rewarded is silence, about how easy it is to confuse love with endurance, and how costly that confusion can become. I learned that manipulation doesn't always come with cruelty. Sometimes it comes wrapped in reassurance. In phrases like "don't stress" and "trust me," spoken not to protect you, but to protect someone else's freedom. The hardest part wasn't leaving. It was accepting that I'd been minimizing myself to make someone else comfortable. And the most powerful moment wasn't the confrontation. It was the quiet decision to stop doing that. If there's one thing I hope anyone listening takes from my story, it's this. When someone tells you to relax about their disrespect, sometimes the most radical act of self-love is to relax your grip on the relationship itself. Not out of anger, out of clarity, out of respect for the person you're becoming. Because peace isn't found in being a good girl. It's found in being honest, with yourself first. And once you choose that, everything else rearranges around it.